that we are all custodians. You want to dominate the whole of Asia and you want to confine India to its coastline and also dominate the Indian Ocean. They need to attack. Okay, there is a planning going on for how to manage a potential limited war with the Chinese. Even 10-15 years ago, it was always India hyphenated with Pakistan. Big powers can afford to go unilateral.
Welcome to today's session, Wajah Be Wajah. Wajah Be Wajah is an initiative of the Institute for Humanities. It started in the year 2018 under Shubhra ma'am's vision and guidance. Eminent personalities like Manishankar Iyer, Happy Mon Jacob, C. Uday Bhaskar, Sunita Narayan, Shyam Saran, etc. have come and addressed our students and have given them a deeper perspective of what they study in the classroom. This tradition was started by Shubhra ma'am with the intent of giving a well-rounded exposure to the students, combining preparation for civil service as well as to understand the realist outlook of academicians and practitioners. Her persistence to revolutionize the study of humanities in India has led this series to be a strong foundational pillar of the Institute for Humanities. So when we talk about the Institute for Humanities, it has emerged from a dream that education for all is a prerequisite. It is a prerequisite for building a just, inclusive, and equal society. Quality education remains critical for pursuit of such endeavors. Through the Institute for Humanities, Shubhra ma'am and Virat sir have aimed to contribute substantially to ensure access to affordable and quality education for all. Last year, foundation courses for class 11th and 12th were launched, which was met with a lot of appreciation from students. In the coming years, similar courses for undergraduate and postgraduate level will also be introduced to give a holistic learning opportunity to all students. We also plan to launch a journal titled Political Perspectives in India, as well as launch programs such as leadership programs for young scholars and early career academicians. There are many students of MAM who have not restricted themselves to only civil service. Instead, have explored various avenues like have joined panchayats, studied elections, and so on. Based on their inputs, there is a huge requirement for such a cause. Now we come to the speaker of the day. Dr. Sreeram Chaulia is a scholar of social studies and a prolific analyst on international issues. He is a professor and dean of Jindal School of International Affairs. He holds a doctorate and Masters of Arts in Political Science and International Relations. His areas of specialization include diplomacy, foreign policy, comparative politics, international political economy, and various more. He teaches courses related to these subjects and has over 960 publications in these domains. Among his recent books, Modi Doctrine, the Foreign Policy of India's Prime Minister, was published in 2016. His book, Trumped Emerging Powers in a Post-American World, was published in 2019. And his latest book, which I can assure you is enthralling, is Crunch Time, Narendra Modi's National Security Crisis. So the book analyzes PM Modi's series of decision-making moves during the crisis with China and Pakistan. In the book, he takes a close look at the Uri, Doklam, Balakot, and Ladakh crisis. He refers to Prime Minister Modi as the least risk-averse Prime Minister India has had in decades. He writes columns on international issues in various Indian newspapers like Dainik Jagran, Hindustan Times, and various more. He also hosts the fortnightly Indian diplomacy TV show on DD India. Professor Chaulia has worked on international civilian peacekeeper for Brussels-based NGO Non-Violent Peace Force. Now, before I invite Sreeram sir, Let me have Shubhra ma'am to introduce today's topic.
Thank you, Dipanvita. And I welcome Mr. Sreeram as well as all the guests here. And I believe this is going to be a productive session. And as I know that foreign policy and international issues has been a favorite students of the civil services. So I believe with his expertise, you will get a different perspective, which is going to enrich your knowledge. And I would encourage that after the talk, you can also ask certain questions if you think related to the foreign policy. So now I would welcome Mr. Sreeram Chaulia to start his talks.
How's the Josh? I always ask this to young people because, we need not just successful and hardworking young people, but those who have a commitment to public cause for the nation and the world. So we need to have that jazba and we have to carry that forward. So it's very important, or else we just become mere consumers of things. So good to hear that the Josh is high. In fact, Dipanvita ji just mentioned my most recent book, Crunch Time. And I use this motion picture popularized Josh is high, sir, in the context of the crisis of 2016 after the Pathankot and Uri attacks. So I hope you get a chance to read it. It's on Amazon. We thought of putting up a stall from Rupa, the publishers, but it's a lot easier logistically for you to simply go on Amazon and buy Crunch Time. And it should be with you in like 48 hours. So that, of course, is a study of crises. And I am not here to speak specifically about crises, but crisis plus opportunities. And that's the theme of this lecture. But before that, I wanted to tell you all that I'm also hosting my own TV show on Doordarshan called Indian Diplomacy. Has anyone watched it? Yes. Okay. I'm happy to hear that. Can I have a show of hands? How many of you watched Indian Diplomacy? Okay. Minority. The point is, I think for this crowd especially, politics and IR, it should be unmissable. It's every Saturday at 8:30 on DD India, national channel, but also on YouTube. I know nowadays you people don't watch television. So just please, I'll request ma'am to also share the YouTube links. Like for example, the last night we did a show on the Egypt-India strategic partnership and why it's been upgraded to strategic partnership. I had Egyptian scholars and experts on it. So invaluable learning. It's actually meant for raising awareness and consciousness of international affairs. So apart from my university work and the writing and the talking, I also do this on television. And you will also be happy to know that we are all trying to push to create our own world news TV channel in the public broadcaster, in Prasar Bharati and Doordarshan. We have only one in this country, as you know, which is dedicated to world news, which is WION, but it's a private one and it's got limited reach and resources. So we're trying to do something much bigger, like an Indian Al Jazeera. And this is long due. People have been looking for it, but it hasn't happened, but we are all working towards that end. So this show, Indian Diplomacy, that I'm doing on DD India is a kind of like a capsule or a pilot project that will eventually culminate in many more shows and maybe possibly renaming the channel DD India as DD International or DD World, which is something we are working on. And this is the G20 year, as you know, so we believe this is the moment to do something big for India on the world stage. And those of you who know what is soft power, you know the importance of audiovisual media, and many of our competitors and rivals around the world have invested in world news programming and sleek presentation from their own respective viewpoints. In India, we don't have actually CGTN, but China Global Television Network is huge actually. If you can watch it online only, it's not available on cable or on set top. But this is big and they've invested billions of dollars, or renminbi to be more precise, trillions of renminbi. to make this channel succeed. Russians have RT. Russians have got a bad press now in the last 1 year because of this war in Ukraine, and they've not been able to win the info war. But before that, before February 2022, before the invasion of Ukraine, they were pretty popular, and in many ways, they were seen as the alternative to the Western media houses like CNN and BBC and so on. So now, where is the Indian alternative? That's the big question, and that's something we are all working on. So I just wanted to inform you so that you know there are some moves afoot to make this happen. Okay, now coming to the topic, why did I propose this? Because you're all young people, and you will all be there during the Amrit Kaal when we conclude in 2047. 25 years. I'm now already into my 40s, and God willing, I'll be there, but you will all surely be there. Touch wood. You're younger, and you're going to lead, you're going to actually see India become a leading power in the world, which is the objective of the, which is the one of the grand strategic objectives we have at present, right? But from here to there, the 25 years is what we call the Amrit Kaal. But I wanted to start with something simpler, which is, what do we mean by this term Amrit Mahotsav or Amrit Kaal in itself? It's actually the Diamond Jubilee is 75 years. Generally call it Diamond Jubilee in English, right? So we are calling it Amrit Mahotsav. And the government of India's translation for this is elixir or nectar of inspiration and hope for a fast growing country. So Amrit Kaal is supposed to be this period of great aspiration and fulfillment of great aspirations, especially for all of you, Generation Y, who will be here to see India becoming a leading power. And interestingly, there are two goals in Amrit Kaal, and I'll spell them out. So Amrit Kaal is, in my own reading, a purposeful, target or goal-oriented quarter century. I repeat, a purposeful, target or goal-oriented quarter century. And Prime Minister has said that this is actually the most important quarter century in the history of this country, even going back to the pre-colonial times, because it has the potential to set us up as a major power, great power, or we are actually avoiding the using the term great power, although typically the international relations literature refers to great powers. So which are the two great powers in today's time as per the... Good. So, we are aiming to be the third great power, but we are using our own language, and I'll come to why we are not calling it great power and why we are calling it leading power. But that's of course not the only target in this Amrit Kaal. The other target, so leading power is maybe a geopolitical vision for this country. But then parallel to that is an economic vision, which is of a developed country with high per capita income. Viksit Bharat, right? So these two are like yin and yang of the Amrit Kaal. You can't separate leading power from developed country. In fact, there has never been a leading power in the world which is not a developed country. Even the Soviet Union, at its peak in the 1950s and 60s, was a kind of a developed country in terms of living standards, although it declined and then collapsed. And China, what's China's per capita income today in nominal terms? Anyone? It's 9,000. I think it's more. I think it's double figures already. 15. Although, see, opportunistically, they sometimes bracket themselves as a developing country, and they say they are still part of the global south. And they say that we are also an emerging economy and all that. Sometimes they even associate with the G77 grouping in the UN. G77 plus China on certain issues because it suits their interests on trade and climate change, for example. But the fact is, it's a middle income country now. It is a middle income country. And despite their demographic decline, the question is, they keep saying, as the scholars say, will China grow old before it grows rich? It's not a high income country, but it's definitely a middle income country. But it could fall into what is called a middle income trap, meaning you can't emerge out of it. And perpetually you will be in a middle income status. So our goal is to actually be a high income country by 2047, which is not unrealistic, and in geopolitics to be a leading power. And what is unique about this Amrit Kaal concept is that it suggests that we are now into long-term thinking and long-term planning. ये 25 सालों का horizon पहले हम कभी नहीं देखा करते थे. We were just living from year to year, or even month to month, or election cycle to election cycle, right? 25 years. Normally, these kind of goals are set by authoritarian countries where there is continuity of rule of one, ruling establishment. For example, the Chinese, they have got under Xi Jinping, they have the 2 centenaries goals. One is the 2021, the other is the 2049. 2021 is the centenary of what in China? Or ho chuka hai wo? What is it? 100 years of the CCP. They've already celebrated. And 49 is going to be there. The Maoist, the communist, rule, 1949 to 2049. So they have set parameters and goals for these 2 centenaries. And in fact, most of the Chinese officialdom, they talk about the 2 centenaries and how we have to achieve the 2 centenaries. And historically, they have had this long-term thinking because of the continuity of power of the same and the assumption that it will all remain stable. But we can't be sure, of course. You saw the protests that happened, was it last month or 2 months ago? Yeah, that really shook them. They never expected anything on this scale all across the country from young people. So, other things remaining constant, they expect communist rule to continue and to remain firmly in power and to meet the objective of these 2 centenaries, 2021 and 2049. So how come India is doing it now? That's something I want you to all think about. Why are we now setting these longer term objectives or timelines and time horizons when typically they say in electoral democracies, you can't think beyond the next election, right? So one, of course, it has to do with the leadership and with the Prime Minister's own view that we are all custodians and that we are not actually owners of this country. No, we are custodians and we have to actually transfer it to the next and to the next generations. So I think that vision has come through in the conceptualization of this Amrit Kaal. So long-term planning had been missing, and it's only now. So for example, just to give you, if you look at the economic side of this for Amrit Kaal, the Viksit Bharat, how can you achieve it? It's only through large-scale infrastructure growth, right? So if you study the Gati Shakti, agenda, it's not looking at something that's going to reap a dividend in the next, cycle of 2024 or general election or next assembly election. It's actually a longer-term transformative vision. So those sort of things are happening now, and we would hope that there's no disruption to this vision. As far as leading power, the march to leading power goes, this is work in progress. You must have, in fact, one of my previous episodes of Indian Diplomacy show on Doordarshan, I had with me Tanvi Madan of Brookings Institution, and we were talking about the prospects for India to become a leading power. And of course, the number one factor is economic growth. There's no doubt about it. It's one of the main currencies through which you measure hard power, right? So Minister Piyush Goyal has projected using CII studies that we will be a $30 to $40 trillion economy by the end of the Amrit Kaal. 30 to 40 trillion. That's 10 times. We are not about 3.5 trillion or so. Around 10 times bigger than what we are today in 25 years. So if you do the math, it requires 8 to 9% GDP growth per annum to get there without major interregnums or breaks. The pandemic, almost 2 to 3 years, was a big break, and we were set back. So 30 to 40 trillion dollar economy automatically becomes a leading power. Of course, it has to also invest in military and other soft power also, and I'll come to that. So what do we need to do? I'm not going to be talking about how we will become a developed country and how we will attain the 30 to 40 trillion dollar growth, because that should be for an economist to really spell out what sorts of macroeconomic policies and budgetary and other fiscal means are required to reach that goal. I'm going to focus more on the leading power objective for the Amrit Kaal. So what do we have to do to become a leading power? Or some of the things are already in motion, but a lot more needs to be done. So, and you are all going to be carrying that forward because you are younger people. Number one, we have to play power politics. Okay. Number two, we have to create conducive external environment for rapid and sustained economic growth. Number three, we have to craft a narrative and burnish the brand India. I'm going to explain each of these. Okay. What do I mean by we have to play power politics? Are you familiar with the notion of the Thucydides trap? You know this, right? Graham Allison has written a famous book about it, Destined for War. It's about the gap between China and the US and whether there is a likelihood of them going to war. The point is, whenever there is a narrowing power gap between an established hegemon and a rising power, the established hegemon gets nervous, anxious, insecure, afraid, and will try to do something, even launch a preemptive war to stop the challenger from catching up or overtaking it. That is the simplest, more simplified version of Thucydides trap, right? So most of the studies of Thucydides trap happen in the context of already existing great powers, but which have a gap between them, power gap. China, if you use nominal terms, it's about 70% of the US GDP. Militarily, it's probably not even 40% of the US in terms of overall capabilities. But that's good enough to be considered a great power. Even the Soviet Union, from the 1940, during the Cold War period, 1948, 49, 50 onwards, was about 70% of the comprehensive national power of the US. But that was sufficient for it to be accepted as a great power, right? You don't have to be an equal to be considered a great power of the number one. You can be close enough and you may be narrowing the gap, and that's good enough. So when there is a narrowing power gap and there is a threat of a Thucydides trap, this can also happen at the regional level, not necessarily at the global level. What do I mean by this? In every region where you have an existing hegemon or a most powerful player, and then a second most powerful player, and number two is catching up or is likely to bridge the gap with number one or become its equal, number one could resort to a preemptive attack or a large-scale offensive. And with the kind of regime we have in the PRC right now, you cannot rule out their, ambition to try and cut India down to size before it catches up with them. So this window of the next 25 years, what do I mean by we have to play power politics? It means that we have to think about alignments and alliances, not just strategic partnerships. I'll come to what I mean by that. There is a genuine, distinct possibility of limited war. Although, why am I calling it limited war? Simply because all-out war between nuclear armed states does not happen. In fact, that's the reason why the NATO is playing a proxy war in Ukraine instead of a direct war, because it will mean mutually assured destruction. Because the Russians have 5,900 nuclear warheads, and the US has 5,500 or so. right? So instead of an all-out war, they are fighting a proxy war or limited war. And you cannot, so the possibility of a limited war must be factored in this Amrit Kaal. It's probably like the biggest challenge to this country. Many people, in our country, due to the overwhelming power of the domestic discourse in the media and in the public consciousness, people think most of our weaknesses are internal. But this is a significant challenge we have to navigate in the Amrit Kaal, and we have to play power politics for that. So how are we going to avert a preemptive Chinese attack? My book, Crunch Time, I've covered crises where they did what we call the salami slicing. You know this, right? Bit by bit, they haven't vacated Depsang yet, although we have pushed them out of 6 other points in the last 2.5 years. But a limited war is much bigger than salami slicing. It's a offensive that is confined to certain friction points. It can be on land, it can be in the maritime domain, in the Indo-Pacific, cannot be ruled out. Because status in international affairs comes not only from economic growth, but also from military prowess and your ability to influence other actors based on your military strength. So if you cut India down to size through a preemptive attack, when the advantage is overwhelmingly with them, if they're 5 times bigger than us right now in GDP, this is their moment, right? If you're a Chinese who's thinking in terms of centenary goals, you want to dominate the whole of Asia and become a peer equal of the United States. You want to push out the US from the Pacific, and you want to confine India to its coastline and also dominate the Indian Ocean. They call it the 2 ocean strategy, Chinese. So if they have to achieve that, they need to attack, okay? And of course, I'm not alarmist. I'm not sounding alarmist. It's a distinct possibility. I often speak to the military training institutions, National Defense College, College of War in Mhow, Army College of War, and College of Defense Management in Secunderabad. Now, whenever I talk to officers there, there is a planning going on for how to manage a potential limited war with the Chinese. Okay, it's going to be much bigger than Doklam and much bigger than Galwan. Okay, so ideally, as a rising power that needs a long spell of quiet and stability, we want to avoid war. But if it is thrust upon us, we have to fight back, right? There's just no option. And that is where you have to play power politics. So at present, what is our strategy to manage the Chinese? This is it's a number one foreign policy challenge. There's no doubt about it, right? There was a time, maybe you're very young and you don't recall it, even 10, 15 years ago, it was always India hyphenated with Pakistan internationally. But we left them so far behind. And as you know, they are in very dire collapse-like situation with not enough foreign exchange reserves to even cover 1 month of imports. So increasingly, and their ability to actually change the status quo in Jammu and Kashmir or to carry out large-scale attacks through proxies and all have significantly reduced. So increasingly, we are now looking at the Chinese problem as a central problem in the Amrit Kaal from a geopolitical point of view. It's right up there, number one challenge. So what are we going to do to deal with that? At present, we are saying we have a kind of a web of strategic partnerships through which we can potentially constrain and confine them, right? So you all know the Quad, and there are many other bilateral and regional initiatives, Indo-Pacific Economic Forum. There's so many things that you keep hearing, and the sum total of all of that is to be able to contain China's rise and to make sure that there's a rules-based order and to make sure that the powerful are not brazenly impinging on the rights of the powerless. In other words, constraining the Leviathan, right? So, but the question is, if the Chinese are intent and they're following the same logic of the Thucydides trap, will these strategic partnerships be sufficient to avert a limited war? Will these strategic partnerships be enough to deter them from even thinking of attacking us? Will these strategic partnerships be sufficient to create room for us to grow without being harassed and intimidated by the Chinese? This is an open question. Normally, the orthodoxy in our country, foreign policy establishment is no alliances. What is the difference between a strategic partnership and alliance? Yeah, but what does an alliance entail? An attack on one is an attack on everyone else, right? So actually, you have to defend your ally. You're committed. You're bound to defend your treaty ally from an attack. And so an attack on my ally is an attack on me. So it entails a higher degree of commitment in terms of security, right? So we are reluctant to enter into alliances because, one, we don't want to commit so much to anybody. I mean, if the United States has to go to war with China over Taiwan or over the South China Sea dispute with Vietnam or with the Philippines, should we get dragged into it and actually fight on behalf of the United States? Okay, that's a question. Hypothetical scenario. And secondly, alliance also entails some degree of hierarchy. There is always a superior alliance partner and an inferior one. For example, NATO is a big grouping of 29 or 30. 29 or 30. Now Sweden and Finland are knocking on the door. They're likely to be admitted because of the Russian invasion. So you're going to have NATO even expanding. And it's a no-brainer that the United States is the fulcrum of NATO alliance, right? Most of the military spending, even now, if you see the data on who's been providing most of the hardware for the Ukrainian resistance against the Russian invasion, 70% or more is from the US. The Europeans are giving a lot less. So if you enter an alliance, you may actually also have to yoke your foreign policy and sacrifice your autonomy, or what we call strategic autonomy. It's a trade-off. On one hand, when you have an alliance with a reigning great power or a major power, it obviously sends a deterring signal to the adversary, because the adversary will not dare an all-out attack or even a limited war, because it will bring in not just the adversary but also the adversary's ally, which will tilt the balance of power against the attacker, right? So an alliance has advantages, but on the other hand, you forsake your strategic autonomy. Now, just to go back to a real life thing that just happened, the sanctions regime against Russia, right? There's been a lot of pressure on us to also join it. And, we have stood our ground for our own reasons based on our core national interests, and have, essentially told the Americans that if you dare to impose sanctions, go ahead, but we are not going to comply with your pressure, right? So this is possible because we are only a strategic partner of the United States. If we were a treaty ally, I'll give you the example of Japan. Japan का यूक्रेन से क्या वास्ता है? कुछ नहीं है. It's thousands of miles away. It doesn't really have any direct stake in what's happening in Ukraine. Although the Japanese fear the Chinese will invade and take over disputed territory, just the way Russians have done in Europe. But that's an indirect, that's like a parallel, right? Directly what happens to Ukraine is it's not central issue. The Japanese are more concerned about China and North Korea in this region. So, but still, because Japan is the treaty ally of the United States, it had to go along with the full sanctions regime on Russia. Every resolution the United States and the Europeans push. Japan goes along on most issues, not just on Russia. So our view is that if we also become a treaty ally, we will forsake our freedom of choice and we will lose our autonomy. And strategic autonomy, especially for post-colonial countries, is very, very emotional issue, because we feel like we should not become, junior partners or playthings of big powers. We feel like we must have our own voice and say, and we have, in fact, a leading power cannot actually be a junior partner to anybody. Leading partner would want to deal on equal terms with other great powers, right? So there is the dilemma. And so alignment, yes, strategic partnership is a kind of alignment, right? There's no doubt in the Indo-Pacific. There's no doubt as to we cannot be non-aligned when you have a country that's got 60,000 troops breathing down our neck for the last 2.5 years and demanding more and more concessions from us, right? You cannot have non-alignment when you have a blue water navy that's penetrating deeper and deeper into our own backyard and trying to constrain our own sphere of influence in the Indian Ocean region. So there's no question of non-alignment anymore. It has zero relevance. Alignment, yes, but alliance is something else. And that's, I think, a very critical question in the Amrit Kaal. And a lot of it depends on what the Chinese do and how they behave. If they go by the expectations of the Thucydides trap theory and plan attacks, not just nibbling here and there, not just salami slicing, but something bigger, our hand may be forced. Just go back in history. What happened in 1971? What was the biggest geopolitical alignment that we did, which brought about the creation of Bangladesh? What was the Treaty of Friendship and Peace with the Soviet Union? A de facto alliance. De facto. Only on paper we called ourselves non-aligned, but the 1971 treaty was like essentially a guarantee, a security guarantee. If you go and look back at the diplomatic archives, the correspondence between Brezhnev, the Soviet leader at the time, and Mao and Zhou Enlai, the Chinese leaders, it was very clear. The Soviets were saying, if you intervene in the East Pakistan matter, and if you open another front, we will be forced to enter the war on India's side. Okay, so it was basically an alliance, and that's how we achieved that great, most extraordinary success of post-independence India in terms of geopolitics. So so depending on the circumstances, you may actually be forced to make a choice. Right now, we are trying to have the cake and eat it too. We are saying strategic partners are good enough. We'll keep on extracting as much benefits from them, security and economic and technological, but we'll keep our autonomy. Can we sustain that choice? I'm going to leave it to you. Think about it. Depends a lot on the Chinese behavior. In other words, the signaling we are doing to the Chinese is, the Chinese are saying, you are going closer to the United States, so I'm going to apply pressure on you on the border or in the Indian Ocean. That's their signaling. And we are saying that we are actually going to make our own choices based on what will enable our rise. And we are not going to be concerned so much about whether you will be upset about our policy or not. We are not here to placate you or to please you, right? We are here to look after our own interests. That's, in a very simplified way, the strategic signaling going on between us and the Chinese. But at what point will this dialogue break into conflict and into war? You can't rule out. If they're willing to, if they're all set to attack Taiwan and take over Taiwan, why will they not push their claims on other disputed territories with other neighbors with whom they have not settled? It's an open question. What will deter them? The force ratios, actually, we have sufficient, because the Chinese have to deal with what they call the primary strategic direction, which is East Asia, where they have to contend with the US Indo-Pacific Command and the US first island chain, second island chain strategy. Yes, they are distracted, they're divided, they have got two fronts. India, we talk about two-front war and all, but they have got a mega two-front because they have to handle United States on their eastern seaboard, ring fencing them. But so we would hope that that is sufficiently enough to distract them from planning any large-scale operation in the Himalayas or in the Indian Ocean. But it's not a guarantee, and we don't know what will be the force ratios, in years to come. It depends on the differential rate of growth between our two countries. As of now, we are going to outpace and outgrow China consistently for the next 10-15 years, but we'll have to see how much of the gap we are closing and how much of that creates an alarm or anxiety, the Thucydides variety in Beijing. So we have to play power politics. We have to think of more advanced forms of strategic partnerships to begin with. Major defense partner is a kind of like a de facto alliance kind of arrangement, right? If you see the foundational agreements we have with the US, they include, so much military interoperability. We're actually going to use each other's bases. And likewise, we are doing with France, with Australia, with the Japanese, and we hope to do more with the Southeast Asian countries, although they are reluctant to come out so openly against China. I mean, Vietnam, Philippines, and Indonesia, especially, and Thailand, these four. So we have to play power politics. We can't shy away from making harder choices, because the more powerful you become, you're going to be forced to take sides and make choices. You can't always be, fence sitting or say that I'll take I'll have my cake and eat it too. We have this, and I'm coming to the second requirement to become a leading power. We have to create conducive external environment for rapid and sustained economic growth. Today, as you know, we are receiving about $85 billion in FDI per annum. Inward FDI into this country. It's a record. 85 is huge. 2014, before the current dispensation came to power, we were getting about $40 to $45 billion per annum as FDI, inward FDI. So in a way, we're kind of like almost doubling the number. And given the late industrialization and manufacturing that's starting in this country, you're likely to see this figure jump up. Just for proportion, the Chinese usually get 150 to 175 billion, or even up to $200 billion a year in FDI, inward FDI. So 85 and 150 were about half of what the Chinese are receiving right now. But there is a concerted effort to what we call friend shoring, bring more friendly countries to invest more in India because it's trusted and more reliable. But a lot of domestic reforms are required, and I'm not going to go into it. So anyway, the point is, like-minded nations, we'll need to convince more of them to invest in this country. This is what Prime Minister does in all his foreign visits, as you know, CEO roundtables and business conclaves, and making the pitch that this is the best time to invest in India. Why does he keep on repeating this like a mantra? It's because we need it, right? We don't have enough of a domestic capital of our own to achieve this $30 to $40 trillion size that Piyush Goyal is talking about. And for that to happen, we need to deepen what are called regional connectivity or regional supply chains, which involve coordination with like-minded countries in such a way that manufacturing, as you know, these days is complex, right? Made in China doesn't mean it's all entirely made in China. They're like components that are assembled different places and then finally put together in China. So made in India manufactured goods also require supply chain. We can't make the whole thing from start to finish. There are going to be many components and subcomponents that are brought together from different countries with whom we have strong connectivity and supply chain networks. So we have to invest a lot in this idea of sub-regional and regional integration. And we have to do this while very well knowing that the Chinese also play the same game. In fact, they have a much bigger game because of the amount of money they throw at developing countries through their Belt and Road Initiative. But we still need to invest a lot in this. And linked to this is the FTAs, the free trade agreements. We can this conducive external environment for rapid and sustained economic growth, one of the big pillars of that is going to be FTAs. Free trade agreements, we have become much more open to them in the last few years. And now, there's a flurry of them. We've signed one with the UAE recently. I did a show on this about business and foreign policy. It should be in the playlist of Indian diplomacy and you should watch it. So the point is, FTAs with like-minded nations have got to multiply, and we've got to become more open to making concessions, market access, and these kind of things. Generally, as a developing country with a large number of people reliant on subsidies and such things, we have been defensive in trade agreements. We did not join the RCEP, as you know, because of the fear of being inundated and flooded, fear of imports, and that we didn't have much to export. But now, with the PLI, production-linked incentives and all these things, our exports are booming. And this is good news. I just looked up the data. 22% of India's total GDP is contributed by exports alone today. Not trade. Trade includes exports plus imports. That would be bigger, like 50% of GDP or something. But I'm just talking of exports alone. 22% of GDP is exports. And if you do more FTAs, in fact, the Chinese, how did China become a great power from being a middle power? It is through export-oriented manufacturing, right? We are now just about, in a way, first there was Japan, then there were the Asian tigers, Korea, South Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam, and then there was China from the 1980s. And even though we are in a different technological era, there is still a pretty much a room and prospect for one more industrialization, late industrialization to happen. So FTAs are going to be very critical for us to reach this goal in the Amrit Kaal. And more open attitudes towards not just inward FDI, but also towards FTAs. This is going to be a critical need in the Amrit Kaal. Third thing, we have to craft a narrative and burnish the brand India. This brings me back to my original point about the television channel. This is, of course, the soft power element. And I did a show, one of the episodes of Indian Diplomacy on DD India is about with Praful Ketkar, the editor of Organizer. We are talking about what is our soft power and what all are its elements. Do watch it. The point is, soft power, according to External Affairs Minister Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar, is integral to global rebalancing. In other words, is not just the economic and military and power politics. We've got to think of this third pillar carefully in the Amrit Kaal and invest in this. We have to craft a narrative. What is the narrative of a rising India? I still remember 2004 or 2005, the Chinese, one of the Chinese communist intellectuals, Zheng Bijian, came up with the idea of a peaceful rise of China. Okay, that was like the big slogan of that time. 2005, 2006, peaceful rise, peaceful rise. All their propaganda, everything was peaceful rise, peaceful rise. And at that time, it was believable also, because they were not being so aggressive and pushy against neighbors in those days. This is the pre-Xi Jinping era. There was a president called Hu Jintao at the time, and they largely stuck to this idea that let's just focus on economic growth and not rattle any of our neighbors. Let's not vitiate the security environment in Asia. Let's not behave like Big Brother. But now, of course, they've completely changed in the last 7-8 years under the current totalitarian regime of Xi Jinping. So they had that branding of peaceful rise. Now, what is our branding? We are saying responsible rise. We are saying, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. We have actually not come up with one single catchphrase to capture our ascent as a leading power, right? We are saying a few things. So at the level of branding, those of you who are into management and marketing, you do understand that we are living in a social media saturated age where impressions matter a lot. and perceptions matter a lot. It's not just the core hard power reality. It's also about how what the world thinks about us. Dr. Jaishankar has been talking about that there is a comfort about India's rise in many parts of the world, meaning because we are democratic, because we have accountable government, because we are an open society, because of all these reasons, if you become a superpower or a leading power, it's not seen as a values-based threat to the liberal world order. China is now increasingly, initially the West missed the bus and they enabled China's rise, but now they've woken up and now they're saying it's a values-based challenge to the Western liberal order, right? On the other hand, you don't see large obstacles being placed in front of us by the West. In fact, the Chinese think that India has, if you read the Chinese strategic thinkers, they say that we have a more adverse strategic environment. The Indians have a favorable strategic environment because the big powers and the advanced countries are not challenging India's rise. They're trying to enable it or even help them. But now the Chinese believe that the window of opportunity for them is over and now it's all confrontation with the West. Because the power gap has narrowed and because of Thucydides trap. So India, on the other hand, there is some comfort about our rise as a benign power and as a responsible power. So that's where I think we have to invest a lot more in messaging, in narrative building. We do it in bits, here and there. There's a public diplomacy division in the MEA. PM himself often wins a lot of hearts and minds around the world. He networks with world leaders, builds close camaraderie and friendship, personal friendships. All these help. But in terms of public opinion, in terms of being there, I mean, if you travel to Africa, any part of Africa, you get down the aircraft and the first thing you see is China Daily on the stands. The second thing you see is CGTN is being telecast in the country with local bureaus, with local Africans who are hired by the Chinese to promote the Chinese propaganda that they're doing great good in their country. Even though they may be submerging them in the debt trap, they have the propaganda machinery. Has anyone watched the Wolf Warrior series of the Chinese? You should watch it because it's not just because it's informing their diplomacy and their statecraft nowadays. It's hilarious at one level because their motion picture, the quality and the production values are lower than ours. But the themes are all very anti-Western and the bad guys are always white mercenaries, Americans or Europeans. And ultimately, it's this Rambo-like Chinese figure who's himself from the special forces of the Chinese PLA, who goes to Africa or who goes to Middle East or Latin America and, kicks butt and beats the crap out of these bad guys and saves the local Africans. How much the Chinese are there to support and rescue other developing countries, fellow developing countries, as they put it. Right? That's the narrative that they've built. So they are number one in Africa in terms of influence. And the pandemic, before COVID-19 came and sullied their reputation badly, in most parts of the world, I don't mean the neighborhood of China, but in more distant parts like Latin America and Africa, they were seen as, they're coming, they got a lot of money and they're investing in infrastructure and they're giving us loans and we need it, So we love China and they don't impose conditions on us, unlike the IMF and the World Bank. And so they're our friends. So that was the kind of, that's how the Chinese have built their brand in some parts of the world. Of course, as a democratic country, and of course, a country which has got lesser resources than Chinese, we cannot, buy loyalty the way they've been doing. We don't bribe presidents and prime ministers and finance ministers of various countries like they do in Africa and Latin America. But we need to think of a strategy for this Amrit Kaal for brand India. And it's work in progress and a lot more needs to be done. It's not just Jaishankar or Modi or Ajit Doval who can do it, It's got to be a large-scale initiative, especially focusing on our strengths. Now, for example, for G20 presidency, one of our focus areas is the digital public goods. This is where we've got a strength. Have you heard of India Stack? You know what is India Stack? STACK. Anyone? Look it up. No. India Stack is a open source software platform through which you can do public goods and e-governance. And it is free of cost and available to fellow developing countries, where you can take the core platforms. I don't know, I'm not myself a techie, but the whole operating system or whatever it is, and you can actually use it to deliver direct cash benefit transfer, implement your social welfare schemes anywhere in the developing world. Welfare state can utilize this. So those kind of things, we are far ahead, and because of our colonial heritage, because of English language and all, it's much more easily accessible for countries around the world, unlike what the Chinese do. And because they're a closed society with a lot of censorship, nobody trusts anything they bring out in the form of, in fact, they are helping some authoritarian countries with surveillance and with to become even more dictatorial to monitor their populations. But we can help empower the populations of the global south. This year, G20 summit, as you know, there's a lot of emphasis on bringing in the voices of the global south who are not G20 members. That's why we did the Voice of the Global South Summit also. I'm sure you followed it just a few weeks ago. So I'm just thinking aloud with all of you, how to brand ourselves as we become a leading power, and how to make ourselves more attractive to the world in a way that is acceptable and not seen as imposing ourselves on weaker countries. So what else? In Amrit Kaal, we also need some reforms. I'm going to close there. I'll quickly talk about a few reforms. I think we need greater global consciousness in our own news media. The same point about television that I was talking about. And in the nooks and corners of the country, we need greater global consciousness. Shubhra ma'am, this group is a elite group because you're all already, I'm like preaching to the choir, because you have an interest in international issues already. But you are actually like a small capsule or a minority. Most people in our country are not necessarily interested or have the global consciousness, right? Unless something explosive happens, tanks are rolling into Ukraine, okay, or Taliban captured Kabul for a week or so, the people have an attention on, but then they move on, right? So it's a natural tendency for people to be rooted in their local environment and to be focused on parochial issues. But we need this global consciousness in the Amrit Kaal, especially among all of you. So I hope that you will be ambassadors, not just because you are aspiring for civil services. It's a lifelong thing that you should inculcate, a habit and an interest. I call myself, being a professor, I call myself a student of this field. So you should all have that strong curiosity and thirst for knowledge in this field and global consciousness. Connect the dots. Everything that we are doing or saying is being impacted by what's happening outside our country. And therefore, we need to understand that external environment better. Second reform, lateral entry and more specialists are required in our ministries. This is a big problem with the bureaucracy is so, protective of its turf. It's not really allowed specialists to come in at different levels. Although there has been a push to bring in expertise into different ministries, that is, I would say, very preliminary work. And people even the G20 Secretariat, for example, we are now bringing in a lot of talent, and I think they've hired a large number of people. Last I heard was 200 or more consultants, simply to make sure all the tick boxes are covered for the G20 summit, and to prepare the background for each event and each ministerial and vertical. So that's good. G20 year is important, but I am afraid that once the G20 summit finishes in September, we'll go back to our old ways, which is maybe, look up at the world when there is some, some mega crisis, but otherwise not on a continuous day-to-day basis. So that's why I'm using the word consciousness. We'll need much more global consciousness, more lateral entry, more strategic content creation for digital audiences worldwide. India is not doing, sometimes we have this notion that we are doing good and, we stand for global welfare, and we thump our own chests and say, We are a lot more moral and less imperialistic than the Chinese or the Americans. We have our own model for our vision for the world. Yes, but then it's not known in the far-flung corners of the planet. Many people wonder, what is India up to? What does India want? I mean, not scholars or intellectuals or those who are studying India. Average people. Public opinion, swaying the public opinion is a big task. Last, greater state-centered jointness for national interest. I'll close with this. State-centered jointness. You know, now we need jointness in the armed forces, and there's a major reforms going on to try and create theater commands, and we have created CDS. These are big reforms that have happened last few years. But jointness, I'm here also talking about state-centered jointness for national interest. Some of you may not recall, but before 2014, when we had these big wobbly coalitions of regional parties, 15, 20 parties, they would all do a kind of a bargaining game for their own narrow interests at the expense of the national interest. So parties in Tamil Nadu would pull the leg of the central government on whenever it came to Sri Lanka policy. Parties in West Bengal would do the same for whenever it came to Bangladesh policy. Parties in in Bihar would do the same for whenever it come to Nepal policy. Parties in Punjab or Rajasthan or Gujarat would do it for Pakistan policy. Right? It didn't look like there was India at all. It looked like it was all fragmented. Right? Everyone extracting their pound of flesh. So that kind of like what do you call the what do you call those forces? Centripetal forces need to be, we have to watch out in the Amrit Kaal. If you have a weak center and a large fragmented coalition, I can guarantee you that there is going to be no Indian national interest. It's all going to be partisan interests. And we will actually not be a credible interlocutor or adversary to our enemies abroad if we become so fragmented and segmented. So jointness of center and state, and this of course depends also on political developments and electoral cycles and who wins elections and all these things. So these are not less important. In fact, great powers, if you find, great powers have risen over a course of maybe 1 or 2 decades because they have a core consensus in their society about what kind of future we want. If you don't have a core consensus, if you're it's like a Tower of Babel where everyone is talking across each other and trying to bargain for their little pound of flesh, then the chances of you becoming a great or a leading power is rather low. So, in fact, one of the big questions about the US's continued dominance in the world is because of its internal, this breakdown of the consensus and the extreme polarization you see. Half of the country has one view and the other half has the other view, especially since Trump arrived in 2016. It's the consensus around what kind of foreign policy or even domestic policy is completely broken down. So, God forbid if we go into that kind of a phase too early, even before becoming a leading power, it's like a self-goal or suicide. So, we need reforms. We need large-scale reform. But I've tried to outline the key points. Multilateralism, G20 leadership, all these are part of brand India. Okay, I'm not going to go back to that point. But anyway, so the sum of what I'm saying is that it's a historic moment, this period of opportunity. There's no doubt about it. The targets we have set are achievable. Leading power and developed country are achievable only if my view, do these things, these 3 things that I've laid out, and also parallelly continue to reform our administrative as well as social structures. So it's not going to be an easy thing, but it's not unrealistic either, right? Japan can never become a great power. Australia can never become a great power. They don't have the core population or the geopolitical strengths to become great powers on their own, right? Size matters. And the point is, in Asia, India is the second most powerful country, but that's not enough, right? We need to become a global power. We need to actually purposefully rise with a grand strategy. And that is what we call strategic culture. I'm not going to go into that concept, but I've covered that in crunch time. To have a strategic culture, how to deal with adversaries, how to deal with friends, and to show greater sense of long-term planning and goals. So everything should be reoriented towards achieving the Amrit Kaal goals. And I invite you all to join this great journey of national rejuvenation and rise. Thank you.
So can we have some questions now, please? I'll start from the front. Yes, please.
Good evening, sir. Thank you for the talk. And I wanted to ask if you could tell us in our Amrit Kaal upcoming journey, which three countries are potentially going to be our biggest friends, and which top three countries are going to be proving to be potential obstacle in our journey.
Okay. Any other question? Okay.
Good evening, sir. Yes. Sir, you talked about power politics in the Amrit Kaal. What about the nuclear question? Because the Indian foreign policy, nuclear policy talks about credible minimum deterrence. So is there a need to redefine that credible minimum? Because we see Japan investing in its defense. We see Germany reinvesting in defense. We see Sweden and knocking the doors of NATO. So
Okay.
is there a need? Hello.
Yeah.
Is there a need to redefine that credible minimum?
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll take it. Now, can we have it from somebody from there? Rajesh, mic hai? Somebody from there, please. Yes, Sal.
Hello, sir. Sir, my question is regarding India-China relation. Like you talked about that one of the biggest threat, or we can say the biggest threat is China. So, sir, I am giving one reference of Dr. Vijay Gokhale recently published an essay, and he says in this essay that China never sees India in terms of bilateral strengthening or ameliorating the bilateral relation. China always see India in terms of its geopolitical goals. So, sir, what should be the ideal way forward if we see as far as China is concerned?
Okay. Can we have somebody from here? Just a minute. Let the mic come here, please.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, ma'am. Thank you for the talk. Sir, as you talk about FTA, that we need to build more and more FTAs with more like-minded countries. But when we talk of trade, business, that will be duty-free. So it is like that is how British enter our country in 16th century, 15th century. So isn't it that we should fear about or should take care of for our country as well as for the world कि कहीं वापस से ये fear तो नहीं आएगा colonization.
Last question for this round. एक second.
Can you have a girl student?
Hello, sir.
Is there any girl student that is there? Okay, somebody at the really back.
Hello, sir. I have one question.
Sir, एक आपका next round में ले लेते हैं. कोई बात नहीं. There's a lady out there who has a question.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, ma'am. So what factors do we have to consider while choosing an alliance in the future? Because the position where India is, so we are we have Russia as also as our friend, as well as US and other allies. So the factors that have to be considered.
Right. Thank you, sir.
Okay, that's great start. Three biggest friends and obstacles. Regionally, obviously the Quad three, especially Japan and Australia, they're resident powers, and the US, because of the alliance system and the basis, it will be also critical. My view is Indonesia and Vietnam also need to come in for the counterbalancing to be more effective. But like I said, they are reluctant because of their extreme economic dependence on China and the fear of backlash from China. I've been to Vietnam and the Philippines. I've even worked in the Philippines, but and in Indonesia. I think these countries are willing to do more on a bilateral level with India, joint exercises and those kind of things, and strategic partnership coordination, but not as part of the Quad, because then they fear the wrath of the Chinese. But in the longer term, if the IPEF takes off and creates concrete alternatives to Chinese loans and infrastructure investments, then you can see probably slowly loosening of the dependence of Vietnam and Indonesia. So I would say after Japan, Australia, and the US, it's got to be Vietnam and Indonesia and the Philippines to a lesser extent. Obstacles, out of 193 UN member countries, we have just 2 adversaries, and it just happens to be that they are both right next door. So there are no other obstacles I can foresee. Sometimes we have friction with some specific countries on specific issues, but they're short-lived. For example, until a few years ago, we were very angry with the Turkish, and with Malaysia, because they were misusing the OIC and creating trouble for us. But now I find that we are trying to smooth ties with both of them. And there's a talk of greater cooperation with Turkey now. So I don't think any of these smaller countries really going to, in the long term, I mean, for them, India is a big market opportunity, and nothing else matters. Religion and geopolitics, all these matter less when it comes to faraway countries. So just as the Gulf monarchies have now come around with UAE, with Saudi, with Qatar, now we've got strategic partnerships with all these countries. I foresee that there will not be a problem. So there will not be any 3 obstacles. It's just 2, the same old. And I don't foresee a third one. Nuclear, do we have to redefine our credible deterrent? Look, I think more important than the arsenal, I mean, testing weapons and all that, and advancing our bomb. What is important is to keep on refining our delivery systems. Missiles and bombers and submarines, the triad, by air, land, and sea. Your credibility is basically determined by how much advanced your delivery systems are. Because essentially, I mean, if you look at the kiloton yields, the Pokhran 2 was sufficient actually. In many ways, you don't need more advanced nuclear weapons over and above what you already have. So strategic delivery mechanisms, especially in the naval domain, because Indo-Pacific is going to be the deciding turf. It's not going to be LAC or LOC. It's ultimately the Indo-Pacific. So there, I think we need to enhance our delivery systems and build more. Our missile, actually, our ballistic and cruise missile arsenal continues to develop fast, and we have more advanced. Agni 5 is the most recent one, or 4 or 5? Yeah. We can cover all our adversaries in terms of the range of Agni 5. So there's no problem per se with the. Sometimes people say, oh, our adversaries have built 300 bombs and we only got 150, so we need to test more. I don't buy that theory. And second thing is the doctrine. We have the no first use doctrine, right? If there are many who argue, especially more hawkish commentators like Bharat Karnad, have been saying that we should just declare the abandonment of the no first use doctrine. And that will be enough to stop the Chinese from ever thinking of attacking us. I don't know about it, but I think if push comes to shove, we will have to do it at some point. Maybe not right now. What does that do? The signaling is that if you're invading our territory conventionally, without nuclear weapons, we reserve, as a weaker country, as an conventionally weaker country, we reserve the right to respond using nuclear means as a deterrent. In fact, you go back to 1999, what Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji said at the time. We have 2 nuclear-armed neighbors next door, and that's the reason we had to test. So to deter them from conventional aggression. Obviously, Pakistan is too weak to even carry out conventional aggression, but the Chinese are not weak. They can carry out like we spoke during my talk about limited wars. So maybe at the level of doctrine, we may need to rethink in the future. I'm not a believer that we need to go for tests, because testing has its own negative, publicity, and it could invite a new round of, Western scrutiny and sanctions and all that right now, and we don't want any of that because we haven't signed the NPT. Okay. China sees India in geopolitical terms, not bilateral. Vijay Gokhale. Yeah. Look, I did a show on this with Srikanth Kondapalli of JNU recently on the China-India-USA triangle. So watch it on DD India, Indian Diplomacy. There's an episode on the China-India-USA triangle. We were talking about this aspect that for them, it's not about territory. It's not like, they need Arunachal Pradesh or they need, parts of Ladakh or Sikkim. It's not, it's more about wanting to impose their will and to change the course of our foreign policy. That is the objective of Chinese military aggression. They don't care for specific, this point or that point. Those are tactical issues. Ultimately, the strategic thing is India is going to the Western camp. At least that's how they see it. And India is being used by the West against us. So we've got to teach the Indians a lesson. That's how they approach it. And this is not new. Even during Mao's time, Mao used to call our socialist prime minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, was considered by Mao Zedong as a running dog of Western capitalist imperialism. You see? So they always think in terms of who is India aligning with. So, and that actually brings me to the other point about factors for choosing alliance. There are some who argue, if we go closer to the United States and to their allies like Japan, it will boomerang, because then the Chinese will get even angrier and will apply even more pressure on us. Why don't we just keep a low profile and remain non-aligned? This is an argument you must have heard, especially those on the left, communists and socialists in India. They keep saying this, that, you are sleeping with the devil, just stop this, it's going to backfire on us. The US is a treacherous great power, and they're going to backstab you. They will not stand with you when the Chinese attack. You often hear these things. My view is that the communist mindset, Chinese communist mindset, is belief in material power. If you look at the roots of Marxist-Leninist ideology, it's based on the ideas, the supremacy of material factors over everything else. It's not principles, it's not morals, it's not values, it's not norms. It's economic and military power. Or as Mao would say, power flows in the barrel of a gun. So if we defer to their will, if we submit to their will and keep a distance from the US, keep a distance from Japan, stop this Quad activity, stop all these counterbalancing coalitions, go into a shell and say, do you think the Chinese will make concessions? I asked Srikanth Kondapalli in the show, actually. Do watch it. I said, do you think we should go slow on the US partnership and other Japan and all this, because maybe then the Chinese will make concessions to us? And his view was, and he's a China specialist, and he was saying, no, they're in no mood to make concessions. They're in a mood to impose their will, not to make concessions. So if we make a concession, they'll see it as a sign of weakness and increase their demands. So my view is that we should actually go in for closer alignments and play the power politics game, rather than to worry about will it upset the Chinese. In fact, 2007 or 8, I think, was the first time we started the quadrilateral Malabar exercises. You know it. And then because the Chinese got angry, the then government decided that it's too risky, let's not upset them, and we stopped doing the quadrilateral. We only resumed the 4-party Malabar naval exercise only in 2017 or 18, I can't remember. Recently, only 3-4 years ago. So I think one has to be bolder, and which is what we are doing in the current administration, which is to say that we are not actually worried about whether you are upset or not, That's none of my business. If you're upset, it's because you're paranoid and you want more and more power. It's not because of something I'm doing. What I need to do, I will keep on doing, and you can't stop me. So I think that is the messaging that's going on. It's a kind of a battle of will also. Ultimately, international politics is a contest of wills, not just of capabilities. FTA opening, is it an opening to neo-colonialism and to another East India Company takeover? Look, I think we have overcome that syndrome of a subservient nation and a subservient society. We have a lot more self-confidence now than in the immediate post-independence period. Most of the post-independent, post-colonial African and Asian countries opted for this kind of approach to foreign investment, believing that it will be like a Trojan horse through which they will come in and then they will repeat the old imperialistic takeover. But now, it's a sufficient, see that just go back to the company era, the takeover, the British Raj. I mean, they could do it because we were a highly disunited country. There were so many kingdoms. There was not even a notion of an India except maybe in a cultural and civilizational, not in a political way. And many of the local rulers actually collaborated with the British, against their own neighbors, right? So I think, and as R.C. Majumdar would say, the empire was built because we underinvested in navies. They could just come in through the coastal route, deep into a hinterland, and present a set of demands on us. Now we don't have that problem. So I think it's a more integrated and unified nation state with a strong national identity now. So I think it's not possible for us to become another, to repeat the old colonial takeover by means of commerce and trade. I think now we are more open and we are becoming less defensive because we have so much to export now. You see, $750 billion of exports in the last financial year. Unthinkable in the history of this country. They made it happen through PLI and through other incentives. 750 billion goods and services combined, and I think Piyush Goyal ji was saying we are likely to hit 800, 850, depending, of course, on the global recession and the global economic scenario, because if their demand goes down, then we can't export as much. But when you have so much to export, we don't have to worry about being colonized. If you're just importing stuff and you're only reliant on inward, things coming in, then there is a danger of becoming over-dependent on one big power. That's what we are seeing with Sri Lanka or Pakistan and all these weaker countries, because they became so over-dependent on the Chinese. Now, they are broke and ultimately they're going with a begging bowl to the IMF. Yeah. Okay.
So we'll have last 5 questions now.
So when you talked about narrative building is directly linked to institution building. And by institution, we are building Central Vista project and Statue of Unity also. But is it the right kind of progress or meta narrative we are building when huge portion of our population is not having the food to eat second time in a day? Or we should go for inclusive growth and not just building meta narrative.
Okay. Can we have somebody from there, please?
Sir, you told that China's military might is 40% in relation to USA. So what about India's military might in relation to US and China?
Okay, somebody from the center now. Rajesh, de do please.
Good evening, sir. That was a nice talk from your end. So my question is that we are looking at a grouping of countries called the G4 countries who have presented possible contenders in the UNSC expansion. India is one of them. However, Russia, after the Ukraine war, has told that it won't be supporting Germany in that end. So what do we see in the future? Is it a possibility that the UNSC as an organization will be breaking down? Or is it a possibility for India to go in without like the other G4 countries being in the team? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go towards the side, that side now, please. Okay, I'll take that, sir, after this.
Hello, sir. Sir, I have question about G20 policy. Is it would be good for taking a short-term policy or a long-term? Because there is now election also is there, and there recession also is there. So is it would beneficial for India to take short-term or long-term policy?
Okay, so there's one lady that we are going to ask, and that would be it. It's already 5. I'm sorry.
Sir?
Sorry.
you talked about building alliances and improving the India's national or whatever interest, but there has been a narrative that India promises and China executes. So even though there is a debt diplomacy, but to overcome that, there the narrative is strong enough to not opt for investments in India.
Thank you. I'm really sorry that I cannot take so many questions. We'll limit it to 5 now.
Yeah, the rest, all the answers I'm answering every week on Indian diplomacy on Doordarshan. Meta narrative, institution building. Look, I'm not talking about domestic priorities here. What kind of a power is India? Generally, people say status quo power, revisionist power, benign power, harmful power, power that is against core human values, or power that upholds core human values. I'm talking about how whatever we are doing in the world needs to be packaged and presented in a sleeker and more convincing way, so that people believe that India does good and India actually benefits me. Somebody sitting in Poland, or somebody sitting in Rwanda, or somebody sitting in Chile should have a sense that India is a country that I like, not just because of yoga or Bollywood, but because of what it does. And because it seems like I've come across something about India and I heard that they're doing some good work in the world. I hear that they stand for. So I'm not talking about domestic policy priorities here. It's not about poverty and what we should prioritize. That's a different topic. I'm talking about how we are projecting this narrative. And even domestically, there's a lot of change. For example, the financial inclusion, the digital public goods I spoke about, those are all big ideas that can be replicated by other developing countries. So we're trying to present these as a model for South-South cooperation. Military might vis-a-vis China and the US. Look, in terms of sheer hardware, we are behind them. There's no question about it. If you look at the number of submarines we have, for example, in the naval domain, if you look at the number of aircraft carriers we have, the US has 9, I think, and China has the fastest growing military shipbuilding industry. So they are aiming to have 10 aircraft carriers in the next 10 to 15 years. We only have 2, and we have a third one, but at any given time commissioned, we only have 2. So INS Vikrant is a very important development, but we have to actually invest. The Navy is saying we have to have more aircraft carriers. There's some debate in it about whether it is advantageous to have it or actually a liability, because it's such a big giant formation that it could be a sitting duck and it could be attacked by anti-ship missiles in battle. And then, if you sink an aircraft carrier, how many billions of dollars of loss is that? It's unbelievable. So anyway, so I don't know frankly, the numerical match, but you should look up the comprehensive national power indices. The Lowy Institute in Australia has an Asian power index. Look up their data. They classify countries in Asia. In fact, they put Japan above India, but that's simply because economically it's bigger and it's still ahead of India, but we will overtake Japan and Germany, as you know, before the end of this decade, as per the current rates. So the Lowy power index is one. Then there's a CNP calculation, comprehensive national power, and they will give you a better idea. But we are behind, but we do have an advantage because we don't have large global stakes where our military is projected very far away. So we don't believe in gunboat diplomacy. We are primarily using the military for self-defense and for maintaining a sphere of influence in Asia. So we are not overstretched. The Chinese, on the other hand, like I told you, they have a primary strategic direction, and then Indian Ocean and South Asia is only secondary for them. The primary is East Asia, where they are facing the US and its alliance system. So it's not only a number count, what percent, it's also about how thinly stretched are your strategic assets. So on that count, for example, we have done mirror deployment with Chinese. They put 60,000, we've got 60,000 for the last 2.5 years. Or is it now almost 3 years, sorry. Since March, April 2020, at minus 40 degrees Celsius, we got 50,000 to 60,000 troops. In some places, eyeball to eyeball. So we are able to do that because we don't have far-flung commitments. And we don't have a second front really. I mean, the LOC is manageable. Frankly, the Pakistanis cannot encroach on Indian territory. They don't have the means or the capability to do that anymore. So it's also about the division of resources and how they are spread out. G4, Russia has refused to back Japan. Yeah, there are many who argue that it's a mistake for us to go along in the G4 formation. Meaning, when you go along with Brazil, Germany, and Japan, you will find more and more countries who have objections with one of them or the other. So they will strike down the whole formula of G4. Chinese say no to Japan. The many in Europe themselves who say no to Germany, and Argentina says no to Brazil, right? And then Pakistan, there is a so-called coffee club who say no to India. So there are some who argue that maybe we should lobby on an individual basis. But in a way, the die is cast. Once we went with the G4 formula, we can't now dissociate ourselves from it. So the critical decision was taken long ago. When did G4 start? It's a historical question. I don't know. At least 15, 20 years ago, we started this campaigning for UNSC seat on the basis of G4. It's not a new thing. So now, and then it will hurt. Suppose we dissociate from G4. Japan is such a comprehensive global strategic partnership now. What will that do to bilateral relations? If we say, no, we don't care about Japan's candidacy, it's only us, take us in. So it's a toss-up, and these are dilemmas actually for policy. And we are still continuing to, I think last time Dr. Jaishankar was in New York in September for the UNGA general debates, there was a G4 meeting, if I'm not wrong, among the many that happen on the sideline, which means that we are continuing to invest in the idea that together, because the idea is that different continents, there are emerging powers or responsible powers, and all of them need representation. We can't just say only India is, the most deserving candidate. So maybe there is a comfort in numbers, but on the other hand, numbers also make us vulnerable as a group to somebody or the other to object and obstruct our permanent seat. By the way, I did a show with Ambassador Manjeev Puri on that, on India and the United Nations. Please, we have discussed this question. G20, is it a short term or long term? I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question. But if you mean that multilateral institutions, whether they will give us long-term benefit or not, see, if you look at the theory, middle powers do require plurilateral and multilateral coalitions. Big powers can afford to go unilateral because big powers have other means by which they can achieve their goals. Could be military coercion, could be sanctions, economic sanctions, could be, financial attacks on a rival country. But so, for example, the US, because the dollar hegemony in the global financial markets, the first resort they have whenever they have trouble with anyone is impose sanctions. Venezuela, Iran, Myanmar, North Korea, you name it. Whoever they want to target, now Russia, go after them and impose sanctions. That's because they don't need multilateral strategy. They can just go alone because they've got command over the dollar. Now, if India wants to impose sanctions or even, let's say, pressure on Pakistan for terrorism, we have to go to FATF. We have to sit with 20 other countries and then come up with a consensus and lobby behind the scenes to maintain Pakistan in the grey list or put them in the blacklist, right? So middle powers have no option but to invest in multilateral formations because of the inherent structural inferiority compared to great powers, right? Maybe by the time the Amrit Kaal finishes, we won't need as much multilateralism. I'm taking a more historical viewpoint. Imagine India of 2047. Maybe we are not going to be so multilateral. Maybe we'll have so much power at the time and influence that, we're going to impose our will. I don't know. I hope not. I mean, some people say that we should not replicate the model of other great powers. And that's why we are calling ourselves a leading power, different from great power. Sushma Swaraj had a famous quip. We are not big brother, we are elder brother in South Asia, right? So she tried to make a distinction. So we are not aspiring to be great power like the US or China, who impose their will and throw their weight around and try to apply pressure on other. We are going to be a different type of maybe a moralistic leading power or what, I don't know. But that is the intent. But multilateral strategy suits a rising middle power like India, structurally speaking. Last one, implementation gap, execution gap. Yeah, look, we have been criticized a lot for this in the past, especially in connectivity. You know, the trilateral highway, India, Myanmar, Thailand, that's been hanging, in the air for like more than 15 years now. Even the north-south transport corridor, we talk about it, but it's only recently been activated, but we don't know in the future whether it is a viable route. So, but with Bangladesh, we have done massive connectivity improvements because of the strong strategic convergence with Sheikh Hasina's government. So, and we are doing it through the BBIN and smaller network, but large-scale connectivity projects like what the Chinese have done. You know, the Chinese run a railway from Chongqing in central China all the way up to Duisburg in Germany, crossing some 19 countries. A transnational freight railway network. So they've been able to build that because they have the money, they're a much bigger economy with larger surpluses. They give loans and they finance these infrastructure projects. And second, because they're not a democratic country, they don't care about what kind of regime they're dealing with. Now we have Myanmar next door, and the problem with implementation of the Kaladan or the trilateral highway is not so much our unwillingness or weakness to implement. The problem is with the terrain of the neighboring countries, which are infested with armed extremists who could sabotage and there's no one coming to ensure or back these projects, from risk because of the insurgencies. The problem on our Western front is as a country that wants to obstruct our connectivity with Afghanistan and beyond. By the way, Taliban are warming up to India this year. Watch out. Something is going to happen. We have opened our embassy there, reopened our embassy there. Of course, not at the ambassador level, but we've got diplomats there. And because of the increasing tensions between the Taliban and the Pakistanis and the armed clashes happening at Durand Line, something is cooking. You will see soon. There's going to be we are not going to recognize them. Nobody recognizes the Kabul regime. But I think we are going to restart our development projects and all those which all went into limbo after Taliban takeover. So implementation gap, I think we are faster now. I will give you the example of the South Asian satellite. Prime Minister promised it in 2014 or 15. 2017, our space research organization was sufficiently capable of delivering it on time, except this one neighbor which has ideological and other religious hatred for us. Everybody, all the other South Asian nations are benefiting from the South Asian satellite. We implemented it in record time, just 2.5 years or something like that. So there are some areas where we are actually pretty quick. You look at the rescue missions, the HADR missions we do, Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief. The speed with which we have become the first responder in the Indian Ocean region is remarkable, our Navy, our Air Force. So we're doing things in some areas which is in our own hands. We're doing things remarkably well. I mean, Operation Ganga actually needs a whole book or something. I haven't seen a full-length work on it yet because it only happened last year. 22,000 citizens and also citizens of some, more than a dozen countries we evacuated at very short notice through a hot war zone where, missiles were flying around and artillery shelling was going on. So there are some things in which we execute and implement and very fast. But there are some which are contingent on, developments in other countries, And of course, we can't do it the Chinese way simply because we don't have that checkbook diplomacy. We don't have the money and the resources to give out loans left, right, and center. So, yeah, but I think we are closing the gap. Promise and implementation. Earlier, people used to criticize India promises and talks big, deta kuch nahi hai, right? But now I think slowly we are trying to close that gap, and the perception is changing around the world, especially developing countries.
Thank you, Dr. Chaulia, for a very enlightening talk. And I believe that in a very short time, you gave a very comprehensive picture. And the students also must have got enlightened and got the nuances. And I believe that this Amrit Kaal, we all be making a part of our contribution to the, not only, it is not just the vision of our Prime Minister, it is a vision of the entire country. And the India is changing, and definitely the way the question was that India only promises, doesn't deliver. And as Mr. Chaulia has pointed out, we are changing, things are changing, and definitely I'll say that in the coming time, India is going to have the last laugh. And I am pretty sure that once you all will take the lead of this country, we are going to realize this particular dream in the very, in this life itself. So I'm pretty sure the upcoming crowd is going to be much more enthusiastic. I can see the people like right now, they are very, very aspirational, and the good wave is there. And I can only say that every age has its zeitgeist, and it is our time. I believe that I can see in everyone's eyes. And thank you all of you for this. So in the end, I believe this Amrit Kaal, we all reach where India's destiny is, which is long overdue. Thank you.